There are three main ways of interpreting religion: exoteric, atheistic, and esoteric. Most of us were raised in an exoteric tradition, where the symbols and rituals with which we engaged were taken to be what they appear to be at face value. So this is biblical literalism, or Islam of the non-Sufi varieties. Then, eventually, we may have questioned whether these symbols and rituals weren't designed to ensnare us in a system of control. At this point, we might have looked at Acts and discovered that the apostles demanded that the whole church gave up all of their material possessions and gave them to the apostles to control for everyone. And if you read that story about the man who sold his farm and hid a portion away and then gave Peter the rest, he was struck dead. He gave up the ghost on the spot. So at that point you start to think, is Christianity really just about the collection plate? Have I bought into a scam? Is it all an elaborate hoax? And when all you've had before that is the exoteric experience of religion, then it's hard to argue against the atheistic interpretation. Eventually, after spending some time as an atheist, you might study the works of Carl Jung or Joseph Campbell or some other comparative mythologist and understand that all religions tend to project very similar archetypes, and independently of one another. There doesn't have to be cultural transmission. If we're going to believe that humans have instincts, we act out certain pre-programmed behaviors, then we ought also to believe that humans have intrinsic archetypes that are pre-programmed in us. If behaviors have certain ways of being naturally, then forms of perception, the way that we think, will also have certain preset tendencies. And we interface with these archetypes through mythology. The function of mythology is to integrate the subconscious and conscious elements of the mind. That's why we bother engaging in ritual and symbol. We don't take it literally. It's not about propitiating to some power which will literally give you something. It's about propitiating to the inner divinity. And esoteric religion is about that realization. The mystery schools in Greece held that the initiate is a part, an element of the one universal feminine generative energy. And Christ says something similar. Knock and ye shall find, the kingdom of heaven is within. It's about accessing God. And Christianity allows a shortcut by taking away the guilt that we usually feel from some complex psychological, hang-up that we have by our own personal history. We can set that aside, the things that we consider to be sin. We can set that aside and lay it on Christ, because Christ has taken our sin and paid for it with his blood. Now, without the exoteric belief, the esoteric forms don't operate psychologically. You can't just study it. You do have to believe that Christ actually did that Jesus actually did that. That God is, in fact, the kind of all-loving being that would sacrifice his Son for us. In the East, there are seekers and then enlightened ones. And you cannot be an enlightened one if you're a seeker. It's not about trying to make yourself better. Enlightenment is seemingly that way. But enlightenment doesn't happen until you accept it by grace as that which is already given to you. Divinity is already within. So you only have to stop trying and experience God. Christianity is about grace. It's about training us to let go of these psychological complexes so that the natural, intuitive functions of the psyche can harmonize with the analytic function of the psyche. And Christianity does this better than any other faith because of the exoteric grounding that it has, because of the tradition of biblical literalism. Now, biblical literalism leads to some issues, like a lot of people believing that the world began in 4004 BC and that sort of thing, and also being tied to the Jewish Old Testament. Judaism is a complex issue. There are many mystery schools within it. Many of the writers of the Hebrew Bible were mystics, and you can get that from the Psalms or from some sections of Deuteronomy. But obviously, there was a manipulative element at work. So if you accept it all, then you don't get the mystic benefit because you create new complexes for yourself to hang on to out of the exoteric reading of whatever you're doing. You have to be as good money changers, ciphering out that which is counterfeit and that which is genuine. So these are the three interpretations of religion. Without a rational reason to believe in a higher power at all, it's hard to gain the psychological benefits of the esoteric path. And after atheism, the only thing that's really left for you that's going to satisfy you is the exoteric path. If you became an atheist, you're the kind of person that transcends a literal interpretation of a faith. You have to have something higher. And that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with people who are satisfied with an exoteric understanding. But there are different classes of understanding among humans. Life is hierarchy. Humanity is hierarchy. And that's also one of the reasons why, having the sacred texts and all that is important. It's not just about ripping people off. It's also that some people have better mystic insight than others. And unless those people are allowed to spread what they have, then the rest of humanity will not be able to advance. So natural charismatic authority helps. So what is that rational justification for believing in God, though? Well, in the East, they call it Brahman, the one reality. When you realize that you're not separate from any of this, and what you thought of as your individual identity fades away under your gaze, then you experience this transcendental realm, transcending the ephemerality of our immediate environment and attaching ourselves to the eternal aspect. What is the eternal aspect? That's the question. What is God? What is the eternal aspect? In the West, we tend to define God as something like an infinite intelligence, or the omnipotent, omniscient, all-loving creator. And that works too. That's also true. It's both there when you look at it, east and west. It's just different inflections. Is it the historicity or is it the identity? Is it Brahman, out and in, or is it God everywhere and our soul carries a piece of God? What is the eternal? That deals with the issue of time. Well, people say that this universe began with a singularity, and that singularity existed in an eternal moment, because within a singularity, you can't have time, right? So this is a hint. What is this eternity? Where can we find it? Well, you can't see eternity. The only thing you can see is time. And, we can only see given complexity. Eternity without time, without perspective. Perspective involves time. Every time there's an observation, there's an interaction, therefore a movement of time. So without time, you can't have perspective. An eternal being is not seen by any given perspective. Omniscience sees all, and therefore is undifferentiated. So a singularity is undifferentiated. What is that undifferentiated in itself? We can't access it with our ordinary mode of cognition. Rationality cannot access it because it is that thing which rationality uses as its object. It's the thing that's moved around in math. It's the one or the zero or the superposition of neither one nor zero, but the undifferentiated substrate objectivity that comes into relation through methods of human cognition, which are automatically formed by our a priori tendencies. These tendencies of thought, thinking of things as space and time, come into being through the eternal. The singularity is the eternal. Complexity begs the question of the origin of complexity. How does complexity arrive? Well, simplicity is something to point to. But simplicity, what does that imply? How do we bridge the gap from simplicity to complexity? Or is there something beyond category? Simplicity, complexity, we're still dealing with category. And so category begs the question of the origin of category. What is the non-categorical origin of category? Is there any other place in nature that we find the undifferentiated? We can point to the singularity, if that's true, if it really is that way in the physical universe. Or we can point to the Planck length, or the Planck time. These things cannot be divided any further. Compared to the complex that surrounds them, we can say they're of a given unit of length, but our units of length are arbitrary. It's convention. The thing in themselves, the Planck length in itself, is indivisible, therefore undifferentiated. There are no moving parts within the Planck length. So being a unit of Planck length means you are of an eternal nature. Nothing changes for the Planck length in itself. Its relation to other things may change, but in itself, it's eternal. It's undifferentiated. And its identity is one and the same with that singularity. The experience of being the singularity, if it's truly undifferentiated, or being the Planck length, is the same. Is there anything else in nature that looks this way? Well, if reality is ripped apart by entropy in the end, and we go to a complete void, that complete void has no objects to establish any spatial or temporal metric, so it too must be undifferentiated. All undifferentiateds are one and the same. It's the same identity, in the same way that every electron is identical to every other one. It's not just that they're similar. Electrons are the same, every electron. That principle of identity applies to the undifferentiated, which is even simpler than an electron as well. So we have the beginning and end being undifferentiated. We have the smallest What about the largest? Is that undifferentiated? Well, when I look out, the largest seems to be highly complicated. There's a bunch of stuff moving on. But that's given my perspective on it. If I take away my perspective, if you take away any location, you don't have a simultaneity of events. That is relativity. Space and time are products of a relative reference frame. So outside of any given relative reference frame, without picking a perspective, what do you have at the largest scale? Include everything in the eye. What do you have? Undifferentiated. So the largest, smallest, beginning, end, alpha, omega, is this undifferentiated? Is there anywhere else in nature we find an undifferentiated? Well, what about behind this, what you're looking with? The aperture of awareness. We cannot measure it. It's what we use to measure. So the eye can't turn around and quantify the eye. It's just a clearing of indefinite size. You can do a little phenomenological experiment. Close your eyes. Feel how large the eye with which you see the blackness is. It's of no given size. You can imagine it taking up everything you can conceive of. Everything you conceive of is brought into conception or brought into perception from cognition through the aperture of awareness. So it's not just what you see with your eyes that comes in through the aperture of awareness. Awareness involves thought too. Everything that we can conceive of, the entire mental envelope, is brought through this singular point at the center. And the point is without measure. So the only undifferentiated that we occupy has a curious principle. It allows itself to be penetrated. Well, in its function as being penetrated, it gives birth to complexity. It allows a relativistic reference frame to define a simultaneity of events and therefore a present, and we have the world we have. So when the eye opens itself to interpenetration and this involvement, then we have complexity. When it is within itself, it is holistic. The mystics, Eastern and Western, describe their ultimate experience as unity, the dissolution of subject and object. That's the eye resting within itself. That's reversing the stream of Kundalini energy from out and down to up and in. That's what it's about. You can describe this physiologically or spatially or scientifically or any way. It's a truth. It comes up in all world religions, not just because those archetypes are there and they're primitive and they're instinctual, but because they reflect elements of reality. So what is God? What is that undifferentiated that causes differentiation? It's not nothing, because nothing is part of category. It's not simply a undifferentiated being. That's our categorization of it. Even that. It's the best we have because we're using language. We're automatically going to be using categories to describe things. But in itself, it's not any particular function. It's the superposition of all possible functions of itself, that simplicity. It's not a pure simplicity a pure simplicity would be what we think of as nothing. It does not open itself to interpenetration of itself with itself, because that simplicity would be a part of a categorical schema. If you take away the categorical schema, you can't have that simplicity by itself. The ultimate simplicity has to transcend either simplicity or complexity. That's the superposition of all possible functions of the undifferentiated. That's the God that I believe in, because that thing is infinitely intelligent. What is the nature of an infinite intelligence? It doesn't have cognition, because that would involve time. If it were an infinite intelligence, every moment would already pre-grasp everything that is there to be grasped. The superposition of all functions of the undifferentiated already pre-grasps everything. It contains everything in its ultimate nous. The pre-Socratics realized this stuff. Plato was very involved with these concepts. The Hindu mystics, it occurs all the time, in all cultures, because it's the truth. This simplicity that transcends categorization. Most atheists want evidence. They want either empirical or rational evidence for God, and it's ridiculous because God must be the source of empirical reality. Therefore, he could not be detected using empirical methods. God must be the source of rationality. Therefore, God cannot be detected using rational methods. You can't prove rationality or the basis of rationality using rationality. Gödel's incompleteness theorem prevents us from doing that. You can't have a rational proof of God or an empirical proof of God. All you can have is phenomenological proof of God. And you have it sitting right at your center. You always have. If you thought about it and if you reflected with that against the other elements of yourself, once you realize that Brahman without is the same Brahman within, then you understand the shared function of the undifferentiated and you arrive at the abstract, what you can attain through mystic experience, but which is ordinarily closed to cognition. So it's infinitely intelligent, it's omnipotent, it contains all potentiality, it's omniscient, everything that is seen by it. It's the only thing that could see, the aperture which opens itself to penetration. It is all loving. All acts of love stem from a broadening of identity. The superposition of all functions of the undifferentiated, or God, is the ultimate identity, the ultimate extension of identity. Every act of hate, every act of separateness comes from misconception, ignorance. God is light. Evil is shadow. It's not that shadow exists. It's not that God allows evil to exist and therefore isn't actually all loving. It's that he's so good, he allows for complete freedom of every possibility. He doesn't control things. He's not a dictator. If you want to misunderstand reality, that's your prerogative. And you have it, and that's why evil exists, because people have misconceptions about the nature of this. They think that the other is the other, so they attack the other to gain their resources, not realizing that it's the same I in them, and that eventually they'll experience it. Everything comes back around. That's karma, and it's true. If not in this lifetime, then the next. And a lot of atheists have problems with that idea, that this isn't all there is. I could make another video on that, but I'm already going to go way too long here. So, it's all loving, and it's perfectly just, because everything comes around. It's God. And it's here, and it's there, and at a certain level, you just have to let it click and realize that, yeah, that's the only thing that makes any sense here in explaining any of this. Saying that it's chance, or that it's out of nothing, well, nothing implies the categorization of nothing rather than something, and we're involved in something, so clearly it exists. If you're saying that nothing is the origin, why did reality find itself trapped in one element of categorization rather than the other? Or is categorization just a false thing? Is it not real? Well, the only true reality is that non-categorical reality. Everything else is ephemeral. Everything else fades. Everything else is Maya. Brahman is the one true reality. God is the one true reality. And the only thing that ever ultimately satisfies is unity with him. And the individual who gives up his own will and accepts God's will is satisfied, is happy. So, that's God as far as I see him. Share your thoughts, and maybe we'll have some exchange. Wouldn't that be nice? That's why it's YouTube. It's not MeTube. It's YouTube. Such an ass. Thank you for listening.